that we got a problem, we can go fix it. And it's like my car. It is never fixed. I think I got it fixed, and it doesn't stay fixed because stuff changes. And we ought to replace it, so we need to continually evaluate our performance at dealing with and adapting and coping with issues as we see them, as we anticipate them, and then evaluate ourselves about how are we doing that? What did we learn? And let's go right back in the cycle. Because it's never going to be, quote, fixed so that we can nail it down. And so maybe that is part of the organizational adaptation, that the leaders of tomorrow and the leaders that are coming up and replacing people like myself in a couple of years are going to have a different attitude. They're going to have to be a lot more flexible in how they evaluate and manage and performance of their organization, performance of themselves. Okay. USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, our Secretary Vilsack, it really puts the onus on the Forest Service in a good way to step out and to, as one of the objectives shows, to lead efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. It's kind of like, we better get the hint here. It's not about doing it because you can fit it, you can check off the box in your performance evaluation. It means to lead efforts. It means to come up with new things. It means to encourage creativity. This level of adaptation, it's our not just the Forest Service, but all of our abilities to innovate. It's not about just managing risk, it's about managing under uncertainty, and that requires innovation because you don't know what you don't know. So this performance measure that we developed to fit under this objective is how many of the national forests, now we're just going to start with the public lands management piece of the Forest Service mission. How many of those national forests can we bring in compliance with a climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy? They haven't had this. This climate change thing, we got 35,000 people out there spread all over 155 national forests. So this becomes really an experiment in organizational adaptation. And how do you bring the science to the organization, and how do you build in the ability to adapt as an organization itself in the future? Of trying to address those principles back there that came out of the Adaptation Task Force was in part developing integration mechanisms across those stovepipes, ways to perforate those stovepipes so that we can get the climate change adaptation work done that we had to do. The forest system managers, we have 155 of those, and then their district rangers, we have about 600 districts across the National Forest System, now have this on their performance plan for this year. That's why my popularity has decreased quite a bit over since when I started with the Forest Service. But so be it. Actually, we have a number of forests that have already really jumped on this, and I think this is the best thing that we've seen because it allows us to codify our plans and to build in. We have it in front of us now. It's not something that exists in an IPCC report. It's not been on just something on the Discovery Channel. This brings it home to us. We have to do something with this. That into account, and how will we weld those together? Because none of those exist or should exist in an organization in and of itself. It shouldn't be a stovepipe in and of itself, and it shouldn't compete with one another. It's all part of it. Should be part of an integrated approach on which our performance should be measured. So if you have, we say that if you don't have mitigation unless you have adaptation. If you don't have carbon in response to its health. So when you have a forest that's ridden with disturbance, drought, whatever, you can't expect it to be a top producer in terms of carbon sequestration. So there are linkages across all four of those elements. And so right now we are beginning in fiscal 2011, that is right now, our folks are doing a baseline of the national forests, all the national forests, 155 of them, to see where are we now? How are we set up to educate our employees? And it goes all over the map. Our initial assessments have shown that we are probably, if we count a passing grade, 70%. So that 7 of these 10 questions in these 4 dimensions can honestly be answered yes. With evidence, that would be a passing grade. So this is not a no forest left behind program, okay? But there is enough of an easy first step here. And we thought we kind of lowballed it, but we're finding that a substantially low number of our forests can answer yes yet. But I guarantee you at the end of this year and the next year and the next year, the scores will go up, because when we look at a forest, we don't look at a monolithic being. A forest is made up of a bunch of different trees. A forest itself is made up of a bunch of different stands. They aren't all at the same risk of a climate-driven stressor. A stressor is just, fire is a stressor, okay? So if we're going to have more fire with a changing climate, we have to manage the vulnerability of that forest by concentrating the growth of that forest on the trees that are less vulnerable, that are more resilient. So in many of our forests, we have lots of trees that are basically contributing to the fire problem. And if we can thin those trees out, that forest will concentrate its growth on the trees that are left. So we favor those trees that are more resilient, that are less vulnerable. So it's managing the risk by managing the vulnerability.
For U.S. Forest Service, you've been talking about adaptive management, ecological forestry for a long period of time. What is the actual difference on the ground, and what does it mean in both the social chapter as well as the economic chapter? This is the environmental chapter.
But instead of saying this forest A will do 15,000 acres of thinning this year, we'll be requiring this forest and its neighbor, the park or the neighbor Bureau of Land Management or whatever, to jointly define which acres they will treat so that they can do the best job they can of managing the bigger events, the fire events, the bug events that work across a system mosaic or a system template. So we could, our performance system in the past and the way we pursued ecosystem management, and I'm making these statements knowing full well that there are hundreds of exceptions out there. But our approach in the past has been, okay, how many acres did you do, and we'll count the acres. Well, you could do the easy acres. You could do lots of acres to show how active you were. You could do the same acres twice. There's all kinds of things, but it may or may not have had an impact at the ecosystem level on those processes. Some of our science, our most recent, have to treat as many acres. If you treat those acres in the right places and create basically a system of speed bumps for a fire, then to just treat as much as you possibly can, or to work under the fantasy that you're somehow going to sculpt and resculpt the landscape, because there's not enough money for that. So I think now it's a matter of we have a number of tools such as ecosystem management and the larger scale approaches in our toolbox. Now the challenge is, can we actually do them? Because we let barriers stand in our way, like even inter-organizational barriers stand in our way. And we have a number of other agencies who have actually gotten together at a landscape level, and we think that they're being successful, more successful, and we think that they're delivering more return for the taxpayers' dollars. And I think that's going to be a big issue, not just in this Congress, but I think in the future, because the U.S. public debt situation is not going to go away very quickly. And so it's got its own fire, but if we keep the fire stoked, it becomes more of a raison d'etre for actually implementing ecosystem management and landscape scale approaches. If you look way back, if you look at the turn of the century, we made lots of mistakes because we didn't have the policy fabric that basically tried to assure, or at least provide, a framework for sustainability. So, and we have the forests now, as they sequester carbon in the U.S., are just now catching up after about 200 and some years of basically degradation. So I think that this concept of sustainability and trading off the long run and the short run has to be in their program and in their policies, and the connection, the understanding of the urban population about what the forests in the rural areas provide, and even what the forests in the urban areas provide, is a part of that formula. We have that issue here as our population becomes increasingly urbanized, and I think the world's population will become increasingly urbanized. There's more and more of a gap between what urban residents understand and what then is done or has to be done or could be done in the rural resource. So there's a strong educational component to all of this. And you notice that in that scorecard system that I laid out, education was one of the 10 basic questions. There's many. Employee education is also about public education. So I don't think education should be left out of any policy framework that they come up with. It's all part of their quote readiness. And I don't know if you wanted to respond to that or, okay.
Okay, great. If you're comfortable with it, I think we'll move on now to the next section of the
biggest issues is how far down, how far down can you downscale big models, and at what scale can you trust them? Below what scale do you have to rely on other information to make your decision? Or how do you break up your decision so that you can respond to the information you have? It's not all about, as I've heard someone say in one of the earlier sessions, quote, having the facts. We don't have the facts. If you wait for the facts, you're too late. You do the best you can with the facts and the projections you have. And if you think about it, all decision making is about the future. There's no such thing as decision making about the present. You've already made that decision. And all the future is about uncertainty. So all decisions are really about decision making under uncertainty. So it's all of these have to be worked into some kind of prediction. So we can complain about our scenarios and our models. One of the things that we have brought into our adaptation planning that's new to us is the use of scenarios. We'll talk a little bit about that. We went through a period where we were basically intoxicated with the fantasy that we could predict, and then that we would make decisions according to our prediction. But we've shifted some of that decision-making approach to, okay, can we at least look at the possibilities and look at the corners of the possibilities and try to make decisions based on developing robust alternatives that do the best job of coping under pressure, the best job of providing grace under pressure. Oh, he's got this animated. I'm not into all this stuff. So establishing a step-by-step where it's mainly dependent on a science management partnership first. You have to have the right conversation between the scientists and the managers. And so you have to put them together in groups. You have to identify scenarios for future conditions, evaluate the vulnerabilities in the risk, and we're defining vulnerability, I think, consistent with the way most of you define it. Vulnerability is a combination of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So as we look at resources that we have not looked at from a climate change perspective before, we have to look at them for their vulnerability now. The Resource Planning Act assessment. So it's their best thinking in an interdisciplinary sense about what these different dimensions are going to play out for a scenario, and they're interactive, so that a climate change piece of the scenario runs through the economic piece, runs through the demographic shift piece, so that you can at least, if you're tired of torturing your decision with the scenario, you can go back and torture the scenario itself. Sometimes for forest managers to think that long term, we ought to be the people who lead long-term thinking, because the consequences of our decision are played out in career lengths. I mean, I only see the consequences of my decisions that I made 40 years ago now. We're kind of slow, okay? So But being able to focus on the time horizon of a decision then determines what options are available to you and how relevant the information is to you. So if you've got a system that you have 1 in 100-year event standards, and the climate change implications and impacts are going to put those 1 in 100-year events now at 1 in 40, you've got issues on your hands. Your culverts are too small. So you've got a bunch of them. You've got, in any national forest, you have thousands of them under the roads. So how are you going to work through that? You can't run out tomorrow and change it. So implementing adaptive management, incorporating uncertainty, that's an interesting one to get across to managers. And most managers seek comfort. And I don't mean that they're not courageous. I'm saying when most people make a decision in a management situation, it's in the context of 1,000 other decisions. And they're trying to be comfortable enough with the information that they can make that decision and go on to the next one. So when we talk about disturbances as an opportunity, it kind of freaks them out. The object here is that most of these systems that are moving, the movement is being punctuated by these stressor events, fires, insects, disease. And if this is an opportunity to replace a forest or part of a forest with a more resilient genetic material, then we should use that opportunity in the name of enhanced adaptation. So we do use it, and we often talk about risk, but in the stock market sense, risk is speculative. It's both downside and upside. So climate change will bring us opportunities that we should be able to assess and recognize. Okay, I think, I don't have Kathy's up here. The small national forest level, you only have a limited number of forest inventory and analysis plots. So the information is frankly not very good. Only on large national forests or regions within a state, sub-regions, areas within a state or sub-regions can you begin to get some kind of reasonably reliable, defensible numbers. So yeah, so there's two things. The benchmark assessment was how the forests are doing on the scorecard. What we call the forest carbon estimates, what we just released just about a month ago, is a look at the same information just chopped up differently, just presented differently. You say, oh, this is a yawner, we always knew that. That's not the point. The point is we're trying to present forest carbon to our managers and to state foresters and others from a consistent methodology so that they can wrestle with, well, what does this actually mean? How does our forest management actually play out? And what are the patterns that we have to deal with to actually manage this carbon, to maintain it, to make sure that it's in a healthy state under less risk. So it's part of that overall. Good question.
Species catch up with climate change. Do you think this is a valid strategy, or do you think it's going to be so nullified by the rapid change of climate as it progresses?
So I think it's going to be dependent on the ability of the professionals to assess that suite of risks that the best climate scenarios are going to bring. In some cases,
Politics affect the forest in your work?
Okay. Well, it's a great question. It's one on our mind. But you know, we do surveys of Forest Service employees, and there is, and if you have 35,000 employees, they're going to start to reflect the attitudes about climate change in the general population, and they do. So we have a number of a proportion of Forest Service employees who don't believe we have a climate change or shift underway. If so, they don't necessarily believe that it's largely anthropogenic driven, that they consider if they do believe that it's a natural cycle and we're part of the natural cycle. And that goes up and down. And it may go up as high, those two components together may go up as high as 25-30%. So that's an interesting internal barrier regardless of the external politics here? How do you move this through a system? Well, you know, one appeal that we're making is that, hey, don't think about it as a change in climate. Go outside your door and look at the change in the stressors that are in your face. And we have a newsletter that goes out to all 35,000 employees called the Climate Change Update. And we get interesting letters. I mean, it's not like Dear Abby. I mean, they're not writing you to help solve their problems. Some folks say, well, you're nuts in the Forest Service. But my comeback is usually, look, when you walk outside, what are you managing? You're managing a forest or managing the activities in that forest that are interfacing with fire, insect, disease, etc. Do you see increases in those stressors? Certainly. Okay, you may not have to look any farther than that. How are you going to deal with them? How are you going to adapt to those? And then secondly, how if we did a good job of building a more resilient forest, and we did not have a climate changing as rapidly as our present science seems to say, how far wrong can you go? You've got a more resilient forest. You've put effort into developing a resilient forest, so it's the trade-off between a false positive and a false negative, and those two different sets of costs are not equal. I would contend that the cost of a false negative, of assuming that we don't have climate change and not doing anything about it, is way in hell higher than the concept of a false positive, that we've got climate change and we're going to do something about it, or we've got these changing stressor patterns and we're going to do something about it. So there is a back and forth, at least with that part of the Forest Service population. And I think in many ways it's, who's to say how politics goes, but part of the responses that we get and the interest we get from Congress is about climate change, the political issue. I mean, every day when I go to work, I have to distinguish when someone says climate change. Are we talking about climate change, the political issue, climate change, the organizational issue, climate change, the physical phenomenon? And those two get blended almost immediately in conversations, and you have to disentangle them. So we try to stick to climate change, the physical and organizational issue, climate change, the political issue, and it sure as heck's not well, it may be, but I don't consider it. It's not a religious issue. Because people come to us and say, well, you want us to believe in climate change. It's not about believing in something. It's about taking the science that's laid out there, the peer-reviewed science that's laid out there, and the weight of evidence that's provided, even though on both sides you got fuzziness and you got disagreement, and making the best decisions you can with the weight of evidence that's laid out there. We are a science-based organization. It's not about climate change, the religion, and it's not about believing in it. So I don't know, that's a rather kind of an agnostic view of climate change perhaps in some people's mind, but we have to, and if some big breakthrough comes along and we find out that no, we don't have climate change, we don't have the level of changing climate, which you did, really a rare event I would say, we would have to reassess where we are as a science-based organization. Otherwise we'd have 155 individual forest supervisors kind of pushing kind of their own, quote, religion on the landscape with this based on historic data, at least on the road system. Okay, so they went through a process to look at roads and water, brought in the regional representatives and got their heads around what were the best projections they could find for temperature and precipitation. And you know, I'm sure all of you know that temperature projections are more certain than precipitation projections. There's quite a bit of uncertainty in those. So they're out here on the edge here, dealing with an element. And they wanted to deal with more than one dimension of adaptation, not just about one piece. So they had a roads and water piece, and they looked at using risk assessment principles that we saw in Peterson's presentation at where they should do the kind of work they needed to do. Where were the pinch points in that system? And is there somewhere where I should point this that gets a better, oh, there it is, okay. But they also wanted to look at vegetation, what was happening to the shifts in vegetation, what kind of translation was needed from all of the work that we've not only done in climate change science, but also forest science. Because we've got about 125 years of research work on how trees grow. That was been kind of our business for a while. And so when you marry the climate science and the forest physiology and ecology science together is where you get your signals for perhaps changing your options. And brought in a lot of other specialists. One of the things that we find in managing vegetation is that the specialists all call the same vegetation different things. Vegetation doesn't know the difference. But the vegetation may in any one day be called a fuel or a wildlife habitat. You know, it may be called screening for a recreation area. I mean, it's got all these different names. And so we need to look at the vegetation itself through the eyes of different specialists. Because the vegetation basically is the template. Whether we're talking about watersheds. Oh, God, I see this as adaptive management at work. Okay. So then ranging where the vegetation was going to go on both the park and the forest across the range of scenarios. And also then looking at wildlife. So we have a tendency, and I see this in perhaps the adaptation task force, to chop up, as we do all big problems. We chop them, we decompose them, and solve individual problems, and then try to put them back together again. And we're doing that in some cases when we develop a separate forest adaptation strategy, a separate wildlife adaptation strategy, a separate water adaptation strategy, a separate urban adaptation strategy. Somebody, somewhere, and it often is the land manager, or the city manager, or the urban planner, has to put all that stuff back together in an overall adaptation strategy and approach, and has to intermediate among those different judgments that went into the separate adaptation strategies. So the wildlife folks got into this and were brought into it because they keep track of wildlife populations, especially sensitive and threatened species, and developed a set of products that they would need organized around the same sets of terminology, like resiliency. What does resiliency mean to these species population? What does resiliency mean to this vegetation or this road system? It's all the same concept, but played out in different ways. And fish issues got in, especially for this forest, this peninsula, tremendous, this and most of the Pacific Northwest forest, especially the coastal forest, a tremendous habitat for fish. So anything you do on the vegetation, anything you do on the roads influences the fish habitat. And so bringing in a number of different stakeholders to get at their perspectives on how some of these scenarios would play out was one of the things that they did. And then to develop the information that the public would need to assess and understand this. By the way, on the back table, this refers to the video presentation posted to the CCRC. That's the Climate Change Resource Center. That is a website that the Forest Service has developed as a toolbox for climate change mitigation and adaptation tools. And we've got some really creative people that have come together that manage this website, and it's the place to go for our people to move forward on this. Is the resource director, resource staff officer, we could call them, on the Olympic National Forest, was the Forest Service side of this team. And it required a whole bunch of effort to bring all this together in an adaptation plan. And right now, they're putting these actions into action. They're putting them on the ground, and they have an adaptation or adaptive management plan set up to evaluate how they're doing, how they're going to be doing in the future. So I think what's happened on the Olympic there has been the cooperation part of the scorecard, and also the span of different adaptation targets or objectives, and the lessons learned from putting an effort like this together. It's just not about us, it's not just about trees, it's not just about analysis. It's a bigger kind of social and organizational effort. So I'm developing robust project design so that all of their projects are designed to withstand as best they can determine across a range of scenarios. And what they've learned from this is you got to keep people educated, and there's a big step from the climate change concepts to practice that demands a tremendously disciplined and active educational effort about employees. And it's as much about mindset as product. It's as much about an adaptation mindset, and it's about not just getting things fixed and assuming they're going to stay fixed, because they won't. Okay, those are all the comments that I have today. I mean, there are things you can do to the forest to actually improve the likelihood of having successful natural regeneration. But it's just simply, if you have that many acres that are being disturbed by fire, disturbed by insect and disease, harvested, and then you can't possibly regenerate everything what we call artificially. And we have a good several million acres a year that are just lost to urbanization. This is what really can, and those forests don't get replanted at all. You park your cars on those forests, and they no longer sequester any carbon. So when that carbon sequestration and wildlife habitat and watershed piece has left, it's gone. So a large part of our state and private forestry program is focused on, as best we can, keeping forest as forest by providing technical incentives, technical assistance, financial incentives, and that's part of our hope for a more robust set of ecosystem services markets that private owners then can eventually find a wider range of income sources to encourage them to compete with, for that land use to compete with other land uses such as urbanization. Well, yeah, landscape scale approach, or in the Secretary of Vilsack's visionary statement on all lands approach, means that we have a landscape is kind of a general term. It might be a watershed, it might be an ecoregion, it might be a state, or it might be a portion of a state. That's a general term for something bigger than ourselves, something bigger than the owner or the agency that owns a piece of that landscape. It's about the entire system. So as we work through our options, then under a landscape scale approach or all lands approach, we would certainly be looking at what other owners are doing. In the southeast, for example, even a small watershed, you may have hundreds of landowners. So are there ways that we can better treat our issues at a landscape scale, especially for things like water, and get more return? Some landowners that are closer to the water source may need to have more treatment and may need more financial and technical incentive assistance just because of their position in the landscape, not because necessarily they deserve more. It's about solving the bigger problem. So that's what we mean by landscape. And some of the, you're asking me about my past now, and I'm getting a little nervous. So when I'm most foresters, even these foresters who live in the south, the southeastern U.S., if they plant trees, they may move on to 4 or 5 different jobs before they ever see the results of those, unless they stay in one place the whole time. So I had the advantage of actually going back. I spent a lot of my early years in the southern U.S., in Texas and Louisiana, and it was interesting to go back to some of the forests that I had helped regenerate in the late, I'm just going to tell my age here, late 60s, early 70s, that had grown, been thinned, been harvested, been replanted, and now we're much bigger than I was again. So that's kind of gratifying for a forester anyway, because a lot of the premise of our profession is about the long term. It's not about logging. It's about the long-term renewable cycle of the forest. So to be able to see that is kind of gratifying. It took a while, but it's kind of gratifying. So, but some of the systems that we deal with, for example, in the interior West, it takes a long while for those systems to come back. They don't grow as fast. Under a changing climate, they're probably going to even grow slower. So their rebound ability, their resilience is being lowered by climate change. So we're going to have to pick up more near-term signals that maybe not be 100% reliable, but the best we can do about, are we doing a good enough job? So we're going to have to rely a lot on signals. We can't just wait a career and see what happens.